Chosen ones, the part of God's calling no one explains. Many people are drawn to the idea of being chosen by God. The phrase itself sounds powerful, meaningful, even comforting. But when we look carefully at the Bible, the reality is deeper than many expect. Scripture shows that being chosen is not about recognition, status, or an easy path. It is about a calling that shapes a person's life, often through seasons of faith, surrender, and refinement. From the beginning of the Bible, those whom God calls rarely walk a simple road. Abraham was asked to leave his homeland and trust God for a future he could not yet see. Moses was sent back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, despite his own fears. David was anointed as king while still a shepherd, yet he spent years in danger before the promise was fulfilled. The disciples were chosen by Jesus, but that choice led them into sacrifice, service, and perseverance. Jesus made this clear when he said in John 15:16, "You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain." Being chosen is connected to purpose. It is about bearing fruit that honors God, not about gaining recognition for ourselves. The Apostle Peter also reminds believers of the meaning behind this calling. 1 Peter 2:9 says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." The focus is always on proclaiming God's work and reflecting his light. I often find myself reflecting on how humbling it is that God's calling is less about our strength and more about his work in shaping our hearts. This is the part many people do not fully explain. The Bible shows that the journey of those God calls often includes preparation, testing, and transformation, things that are not always visible from the outside but are essential in God's plan. Number 1. Chosen means called for God's purpose, not personal comfort. One of the clearest patterns in the Bible is that when God chooses someone, he calls them for his purpose, not for their comfort. The idea of being chosen can sometimes sound like a position of honor, but in Scripture, it is always connected to responsibility and obedience. When God called Abraham, the calling immediately required faith and movement. Abraham was not given a comfortable explanation or a detailed plan for the future. Instead, God asked him to leave what was familiar and trust him step by step. Genesis 12:1 says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you.'" Abraham's calling began with surrender. The purpose of God required him to walk forward even when the full picture was not visible. The same pattern appears again with the disciples. Jesus did not choose them simply to give them a title or a position. He chose them to follow him, to learn from him, and eventually to carry the message of the gospel to others. Their calling involved sacrifice, travel, persecution, and deep commitment. Jesus explained this clearly in John 15:16. "You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain." The emphasis is on fruit, on a life that reflects God's work and produces something meaningful for his kingdom. This shows an important truth. Being chosen in the biblical sense means being entrusted with something. God's calling invites a person into his plans, but those plans are centered on his will rather than our personal comfort. I sometimes reflect on how different this perspective is from what many people expect, because the Bible continually reminds us that God's calling is about faithfulness more than convenience. Throughout Scripture, those who were chosen discovered that their lives were meant to serve something greater than themselves. Their calling pointed beyond personal gain and toward God's purpose in the world. Number 2, the hidden season. Why God often prepares the chosen in isolation. Another part of the journey that the Bible quietly reveals is the season of preparation. Before many of God's servants stepped into their visible calling, they experienced long periods that seemed hidden, quiet, or even lonely. These seasons were not accidents. They were part of God's preparation. Joseph is a powerful example. God gave him dreams about the future when he was young, but the path between the promise and the fulfillment was difficult. Joseph was rejected by his brothers, sold into slavery, and later placed in prison. From the outside, it may have looked like his life was moving in the wrong direction. Yet during those hidden years, God was shaping Joseph's character and preparing him for leadership. Eventually, Joseph himself recognized God's purpose through those trials. In Genesis 50:20, he said to his brothers, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." The years that seemed hidden were actually part of God's greater plan. David experienced something similar. After he was anointed as the future king of Israel, he did not immediately take the throne. Instead, he spent years in the wilderness while King Saul pursued him. Those years in caves and deserts became a time when David learned to depend deeply on God. Psalm 57:1 reflects David's heart during those difficult seasons. "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for my soul trusts in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge until these calamities have passed by." These hidden seasons teach an important lesson. God often prepares people privately before he uses them publicly. Character, faith, patience, and humility are formed during times when very few people are watching. I personally think these quiet seasons can feel confusing at times, but the Bible repeatedly shows that God is working even when the purpose is not immediately visible. For many of those whom God called, the preparation happened in places of silence, waiting, and trust. And through those seasons, God shaped the hearts of the people he had chosen. Number 3, the testing of faith. Why the chosen often face trials. Another truth the Bible reveals is that faith is often tested. When God calls someone, their journey frequently includes trials that shape their trust in him. These moments are not meant to destroy faith, but to strengthen and refine it. The book of James explains this clearly. James 1:2-3 says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." Trials are not meaningless interruptions. According to Scripture, they become part of the process through which faith grows deeper and stronger. Job is one of the clearest examples in the Bible. Job was described as a righteous man who feared God, yet he experienced profound loss and suffering. In a short time, he lost his possessions, his health, and even his children. From a human perspective, it was difficult to understand why such suffering occurred, yet through these trials, Job's faith was refined. Even in the middle of his suffering, Job declared his trust in God. Job 13:15 says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." These words show a faith that is not based only on circumstances, but on a deep confidence in God's character. The New Testament continues this same teaching. The Apostle Peter explained that trials serve a refining purpose for believers. In 1 Peter 1:6-7, he wrote, "Though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Faith that has never been tested often remains shallow. But when believers walk through difficulties while trusting God, their faith becomes more mature and rooted. I sometimes find it striking that the Bible never promises a life without hardship for those who follow God. Instead, it repeatedly shows that God walks with his people through those trials and uses them to shape their character. Throughout Scripture, testing is not presented as a sign that God has abandoned someone. More often, it is part of the process through which he strengthens the faith of those he has called. Number 4, the misunderstanding of others. When people don't recognize God's work in you. Another part of the journey that Scripture quietly reveals is misunderstanding. Many of the people God called were not immediately recognized or supported by those around them. In fact, some of them faced doubt, criticism, and rejection, even from people close to them. Joseph experienced this early in his life. When he shared the dreams that God had given him, his own brothers responded with jealousy and anger. Instead of recognizing that God might be doing something in Joseph's life, they rejected him and eventually sold him into slavery. What God was beginning in Joseph was not understood by the people closest to him. David also experienced something similar. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the future king of Israel, David was not even brought forward at first. His own family did not consider him the obvious choice. Later, when David visited the battlefield where Goliath stood against Israel, his older brother criticized him and questioned his motives. Yet God often works in ways that people do not immediately recognize. In 1 Samuel 16:7, the Lord tells Samuel, "For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." This reminds us that God's calling is not based on human expectations or appearances. Even Jesus experienced rejection and misunderstanding. Many people who saw his works still doubted him. Some questioned his authority, while others refused to believe in him despite witnessing his teachings and miracles. John 1:11 describes this reality in simple words. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. The pattern appears again and again throughout the Bible. God often begins his work quietly, and not everyone recognizes it right away. Sometimes people misunderstand what they cannot yet see or understand. I think this part of the journey can be difficult, because people naturally hope to be understood by others. Yet Scripture shows that faithfulness to God does not always come with immediate recognition. The Bible encourages believers to remain faithful even when others do not fully understand their path. What ultimately matters is not human approval, but walking faithfully in the calling and purpose that God gives. Number 5. The call to obedience. Why being chosen requires surrender. Another truth the Bible reveals is that God's calling always invites a person into obedience. Being chosen by God is not simply about receiving a promise or a purpose. It also requires a willingness to trust Him enough to follow where He leads, even when the path is uncertain. One of the clearest examples is Abraham. God promised to bless him and make him the father of many nations, but Abraham's journey was filled with moments that required deep trust. At one point, God asked Abraham to offer his son Isaac, the very son through whom the promise was supposed to come. From a human perspective, this request was difficult to understand. Yet Abraham responded with obedience. Genesis 22 records God's instruction, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I shall tell you." Abraham moved forward in faith, trusting that God's purposes were greater than what he could see in that moment. The New Testament also shows that obedience was central to the lives of those Jesus called. When Jesus invited his first disciples to follow him, they responded immediately. Matthew 4:19-20 says, "Then he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' They immediately left their nets and followed him." Their response shows a willingness to leave behind familiar routines in order to follow Christ. Obedience in the Bible is not presented as blind action, but as trust in God's wisdom and character. When God calls someone, He also invites them to believe that His guidance is good, even when the full outcome is not yet clear. This is why surrender becomes an important part of the journey. Following God often means letting go of control and allowing Him to lead the direction of our lives. I sometimes reflect on how challenging obedience can be, because it asks us to trust God not only with our beliefs, but with our decisions and our future. Throughout Scripture, those who walked closely with God were people who learned to say yes to Him even when obedience required courage, sacrifice, or patience. Their willingness to follow God became part of how His purposes were carried out in the world. Number 6. Spiritual responsibility. The weight of being chosen. Another part that the Bible makes clear is that being chosen by God also carries responsibility. When God entrusts someone with a calling, that calling is not only a privilege, it also brings a deeper level of accountability. Scripture repeatedly shows that those who receive more understanding or influence are expected to walk carefully and faithfully before God. Jesus spoke directly about this principle. In Luke 12:48, He said, "For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required, and to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more." These words remind us that spiritual calling is not about status, it is about stewardship. When God gives someone a role, a message, or an opportunity to serve, He also expects faithfulness in how that responsibility is carried out. Moses experienced this weight in a very real way. God chose him to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, a task that required courage, patience, and constant reliance on God. Leading such a large nation through the wilderness was not easy. The people often complained, doubted, or lost faith. Moses frequently had to intercede for them and guide them back toward trust in the Lord. In Numbers 12:7, God says about Moses, "My servant Moses is faithful in all my house." This description highlights what God values most in those he calls faithfulness. Moses was not perfect, but he took his responsibility seriously and sought to follow God's direction. The prophets also carried heavy spiritual responsibility. Jeremiah was called to speak God's words to a nation that often refused to listen. His message was not always welcomed, yet he remained committed to delivering what God had given him. I often think about how sobering this truth is, because the Bible shows that calling is not something to take lightly. It is something that requires humility and steady faith. Those whom God chooses are not meant to carry their responsibility alone. Throughout Scripture, God strengthens and guides his servants. Yet the calling still asks for commitment, integrity, and a heart that seeks to honor him in every step of the journey. Number 7. The ultimate purpose, reflecting God's glory, not our own. When the Bible speaks about people being chosen by God, it always leads to one central purpose, that God's glory would be revealed through their lives. Scripture never presents calling as a way for a person to elevate themselves or gain recognition. Instead, it shows that those whom God calls become instruments through which his character, truth, and mercy are made visible. The Apostle Peter explains this purpose very clearly. In 1 Peter 2:9 he writes, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Notice the focus of the verse. The calling is not centered on the individual, but on proclaiming what God has done. The chosen are meant to reflect his light and make his goodness known. Jesus also taught that the life of a believer should produce fruit that points back to God. In John 15:8 he said, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples." The fruit that grows from a faithful life, love, faithfulness, patience, truth, and compassion, becomes evidence that God is working in that person's heart. This pattern appears again and again throughout Scripture. When David defeated Goliath, he made it clear that the victory belonged to the Lord. When the apostles performed miracles or preached the gospel, they directed people toward Christ rather than toward themselves. Even the Apostle Paul reminded believers that their strength and ability come from God. In fact, Paul explained that God often works through ordinary people so that his power becomes even more evident. When people see a life changed by faith, they are meant to recognize the hand of God at work, rather than human strength alone. I personally find this truth deeply grounding, because it reminds me that the purpose of faith is not to draw attention to ourselves, but to reflect the goodness and grace of God. In the end, the meaning of being chosen is not about standing above others. It is about living in a way that reflects God's light. Through faith, obedience, and humility, a person's life can quietly point others toward the one who called them. Conclusion: understanding the true meaning of being chosen. When we look carefully at the Bible, the idea of being chosen takes on a deeper meaning than many people first expect. Scripture does not describe it as a path of constant comfort or recognition. Instead, it reveals a journey that often includes preparation, testing, responsibility, and faithful obedience. The lives of Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, and the apostles show this clearly. Each of them experienced moments that shaped their character and strengthened their trust in God. Some walked through seasons of waiting. Others faced misunderstanding or hardship. Yet through every stage, God was at work, forming their faith and guiding them toward his purposes. The Bible shows that God's calling is never empty or meaningless. Even when the path seems difficult, God uses those moments to shape the heart of the person he has called. Faith grows deeper, humility develops, and trust in God becomes stronger. The Apostle Paul captures this idea beautifully in 2 Corinthians 4:7. "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us." Human lives are described as simple vessels, yet God places something valuable within them: his truth, his grace, and his message to the world. This reminds us that the focus of the calling is always God himself. The purpose is not personal glory, but participation in his work. I often think about how this perspective brings clarity and humility, because it shows that walking with God is not about becoming important, but about becoming faithful. In the end, Being chosen according to the Bible means being invited into God's greater story. It is a life where faith is refined, obedience is learned, and every step gradually points back to the one who called us out of darkness into his light.